Well, the good thing about the 80s is that there was such a cornucopia of great horror films that I remember.
The Shining.
Pet Sematary.
The Halloween movies.
Nightmare on Elm Street.
The Thing.
Child's Play.
Elvira, Mistress of the Dark.
Extra.
Company of Wolves.
Cujo.
Jaws 3 in 3D.
The Howling.
The Hunger.
Basket Case.
Maniac.
The Lost Boys, Near Dark.
Friday the 13th.
Evil Dead.
Evil Dead 2.
Return of the Living Dead, Day of the Dead.
Poltergeist.
American Werewolf in London.
Monster Squad.
The Fly, Hellraiser.
The Changeling.
Reanimator.
Sleepaway Camp.
Pumpkinhead, and Friday the 13th Part 4.
In the 60s and 70s, horror was looked down on. The Hollywood community has always looked at it as the redheaded stepchild. And there was a huge blossoming of creative energy.
The 80s had a lot of really good horror films made.
A time of such artistic freedom that you could make anything.
It was a free-for-all for concepts.
Visual effects got incredibly elaborate in the 80s.
There was this strange sort of rebellious nature.
It started to be normal to have really kick-ass women in great parts.
We were getting creature movies. We were getting vampire movies. We were getting more slasher movies. Everybody realized that horror could be fun.
Like the lid was off, man. Like you could do and say and create whatever you wanted.
We would just like completely nerd out about all this stuff.
It might have been cheesy, but it was also like, holy crap.
We have such sights to show you.
I think every single person on this earth has a little bit of darkness in them. A horror film is a good avenue to really let some of those feelings out.
Being confronted with your fears in a movie is so safe, like the old cliche about the roller coaster. You get on, you're terrified, you know you're not going to die, you get off, you went through something that you can share with your buddies or your girlfriend or whomever and say, wow, we did that. But there's also the confrontation of psychological fears. And most of us, particularly as our hair grays, the fear is more about mortality than it is about anything else.
Why do we make up horror when we have so much horror in the real world? And I think it's because it's a coping mechanism for a lot of people.
People love to watch horror because it's a way of sublimating their own fears. Even though as a kid I couldn't watch them, I was too afraid. But there's something of, I'm glad that's not me.
And they can enjoy someone else doing it and get a little bit of a release.
I mean, everyone, when they're watching a horror movie, likes to think of what they would do in that situation. That's why you always have the stereotype of people yelling at the screen of like, don't go in there, don't go up the stairs. And it's so fun to watch that and think about, would I survive this horror movie?
The greatest war between good and evil always takes place within our own souls. Horror tries to resolve that, tries to contend with that. That's what all those stories are about. It's classic mythology.
One of the reasons I think horror movies appeal to a younger audience, there's a sense of immortality. They don't think about life or death. And so the body being rent asunder is more entertaining than it is personal. I think the more painful and the more genuine the fears are that are confronted in horror movies, the more therapeutic and more deeply enriching the experience can be.
So much stuff going on in the 80s. Mind-blowing when you think back of, how much stuff there was. Movies or music or radio, or we started the MTV generation, which led to a million other things that influenced movies and influenced television and influenced more music.
MTV was the hottest thing on earth. You just had it on all the time.
Turn it on, leave it on. America, see the music you want to see.
Cyndi Lauper, of course, Tom Petty and Jackson Browne, Bruce Springsteen. I knew the words to everything.
The top 40 stuff was off the chain. I mean, it was hit after hit after hit, great group after great group.
And there was a lot of good metal music in the 80s, you know, Metallica and Ozzy.
Really saccharine Olivia Newton-John romantic ballads on the one hand, and you had punk on the other hand.
And we had slicker action heroes. There was a lot of 80s hair going on. It was a lot like Mel Gibson's hair in Lethal Weapon. I'm not sure I liked it.
Mullet! Yeah, it wasn't pretty.
We all had this big, huge hair and Aquanet.
The hair was beyond teased, it was bullied.
I remember Jane Fonda workout, watching people walk down the street in workout outfits, which to me was like completely bizarre.
Big hair, big shoulder pads, and cocaine. Lots of cocaine.
Maybe Ronald Reagan inspired all the horror.
You had the fuddy-duddy sort of older generation saying, no, we let the kids play long enough at the wheel, now we're going to take the wheel back over. And that was really the Reagan era. And it was a very oppressive and dark time. It was hard to be gay in that era. It was hard to state certain political views in that period. Because the 80s were an era of excess in every conceivable way. Drugs, disco, sex, the tragedy of the AIDS epidemic. There were a lot of very heightened things going on in that decade, and the horror movies were an absolute reflection of that.
And they say there's a theory that horror thrives when there's a repressive government. What scares us says a lot about the society.
Between midnight and 1, it will find you.
After Halloween, I had a deal with Avco Embassy to make 2 films, and the first one turned out to be The Fog. It was a ghost story, conceived on a trip to England and Stonehenge. I said to Deborah Hill, man, it's really amazing here. There's a fog bank at the time, was off in the distance. I wonder what's in there, we said. I was going to get hired for horror films. That's what was going to happen, because that's where I had a hit. So off we went.
You know, it's kind of an old-fashioned ghost story. It's not big, gory, scary stuff.
The Fog was shot up in Point Reyes, California. It was a beautiful area.
My dear friend, Adrienne Barbeau, she spent the entire time up in that tower. And so we were never, ever on screen together. Jamie Lee, she's hitchhiking, and the first thing she says when she gets in the car is, "Are you weird?"
Are you weird?
Yes, I am. Then I offer her a sip of beer, and and there we are in bed. Just like that, it's that easy. 'Cause I'm smooth. I don't think it bothered her to get on that Scream Queen path, as long as she thought she might be able to get off of it. And she did.
The Fog has Nick Castle as the lead. That's the name of the character in it. I also remember that very fondly because as you pan across inside Adrienne's room, she's holding a baby, and that's my son.
The guys that come out of the fog at the end into the church take Hal Holbrook to heaven, or hell, somewhere.
The seaweed dudes did not like the seaweed dudes at all.
They look great in their own seaweedy, oogie outfits. Big box fans and fog machines at the end of a street trying to make enough fog to look eerie and creepy, threatening. The slightest breeze took it all away, and then start over again, kind of build it up and get it going.
It was revamped after we finished it, because it didn't work, and the script was changed.
It didn't get going quick enough, somehow.
That was a nightmare. I don't ever want to do that again.
The Changeling.
In The Changeling, George C. Scott discovers something's rotten in Seattle while investigating the death of a young child who used to live at his creepy new mansion. He plays John Russell, who's a composer recovering from the tragedy of losing his family, and he actually stars opposite his real-life wife, Trish Van Devere, as he comes to realize that the underage ghost wants to do more than just play.
It's a brooding, melancholy tone poem, and I just really, was hypnotized by that movie.
You think it's sort of a haunted house movie, but it's about so much more. It's so interesting and deep. The acting in it is incredible. The house that they shot that film in is gorgeous. And you think it's a real house, but it's not. That was a set. And the exterior of that film was built over another house that was existing. It's very mood-inducing and anxiety-producing the whole way through.
There's plenty of classic ghost story chills in this one, and The Changeling makes for a nice companion piece to Peter Straub's Ghost Story adaptation, which came out the following year.
I can remember seeing John Carpenter's Halloween, which, unlike some sort of British horror, ghosty movie, was very real feeling, I thought very well acted, extremely well shot. The idea that you could create a really simple story that had scary elements connected to it opened the door to Friday the 13th.
Friday the 13th.
A lot of people make their first horror movies because they're cheap, they don't require stars or anybody familiar. And particularly in the 1980s, all you needed was a string of creative kills to make a successful movie, thanks to Friday the 13th and its ilk.
We didn't have a clue that it was ever going to be successful or going to be changing horror or anything like that. What we were trying to do is come up with a credible movie that would run 90 minutes and have sound and words coming out of people's mouths at the right time and hope that it worked out okay. That was our entire ambition.
I think we were all flying by the seat of our pants, having a good time doing this. My death scene was really, really fun. Tom Savini made the mold of my neck, and when I lifted my head back like that, it would open up perfectly.
There was the POV of the killer, but you never saw the killer. All you knew was like, wow, this person's upset. When the music comes in, then you're seeing what the killer sees, as opposed to just a shot with the camera.
We weren't doing anything, we were just messing up.
Everybody loves the Harry Manfredini signature Friday the 13th. He says it's kick, 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 mama, maka's kill, and mom, but I always hear ch-ch-cha. But maybe it's my hearing.
I thought it was ha, 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 ha. But it's really kill, 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 kill.
Ch-ch-ch. That's how I do it, anyway.
So many gory, scary moments, but the one that really comes to mind is Kevin Bacon's kill. So sick. Oh, it was horrible.
The brilliant Betsy Palmer. I mean, she was in Mr. Robert. She was a very good actress. How in the world does she become the crazed killer?
He wasn't a very good swimmer.
She smiles when she says it. Meanwhile, they've cut the little Jason drowning, and I'm going like, you're crazy. You know you're crazy, and you don't care. That's one scary personality.
Get her. Kill her. Shooting Friday the 13th was a piece of cake. A bunch of us having a great time and, making this movie, and it wasn't scary at all. But the first time I saw it, I actually had some nightmares. The end scene I did not know was coming. Alice is in the canoe, so relieved, and Jason, the kid, he jumps out of the lake and looking so weird and distorted. Thank you, Tom Savini, for scaring the hell out of me.
The fact that it became as successful as it did was mostly luck, being at the right place at the right time. It just all came together.
It was a scary film, for what it was at the time, but I don't think anybody thought there was going to be, I don't know, what are we at, like 12 of these things?
The Shining is an incredibly powerful movie. The reviews when it came out were absolutely terrible across the board. There may have been the occasional exception, but it was not a well-liked movie. However, it connected with a young audience in such a powerful way that it became iconic. And I was so crashingly disappointed with it because I loved the book. And it's not the book.
Was something about Kubrick's take on that was just so arch.
Sometimes it takes you a few watches before you gain appreciation for something.
But it has that Kubrick quality of hypnotic fascination that you can't get away from. And if I happen to click on it, I'm going to watch it.
I think The Shining is probably the best performance in any horror film, maybe ever.
You didn't let me finish my sentence. I said, I'm not going to hurt you. I'm just going to bash your brains.
Boy, does he go off the rails in that one.
Here's Johnny.
All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. Terrifying.
Shelley Duvall looks honestly terrified, and Jack Nicholson honestly looks like he can't stand her. I mean, to the point where I'm thinking, am I seeing the characters or I'm seeing the actors on set like freaking out? And that's just how good they were.
That's always the hardest part to play, is the wife who has to like make the decision, is my husband nuts or is it just me? And I think every woman on the face of the planet wants to give their husband the benefit of the doubt until the very last minute when it's like, I gotta get out of here.
You've got a big surprise coming to you.
The two twins, I mean, I'll never forget that image. And the woman in the bathtub, that's something that was seared into my brain forever and ever and ever.
The scene that always sticks out to me is when he's at the bar. He's talking, and then we cut, and there's actually a bartender there. Every line, every beat in that whole scene, he just chews it up. It's just, you can't take your eyes off him.
I think any movie where a parent is the villain is really hard to watch. It really hooks into, for me, this feeling of trusting the men around you and how it would feel to all of a sudden be scared of the person that you love. It's so scary.
The big ending is out there in the maze. Now you look at that movie. What's missing in that sequence? It's supposed to be out in the freezing cold, but they shot it in a soundstage. They didn't get any oxidation of breath. Kubrick is such a stickler for detail, and everything's got to be just right. And how much money is it cost doesn't matter. Let's get it right. And yet, no oxidation of breath.
The Shining was promoted as a Stanley Kubrick movie, not a Stephen King movie. There was a long period of time when the name Stephen King was avoided by marketers because it identified the movie as a horror film, and a horror film was still considered disposable trash. Stephen King himself said he hated it.
King had actually written a script for Kubrick for The Shining, which Kubrick just tossed aside. I think it was painful to King to see this because it was such a personal book to him.
When Kubrick turned his hand to The Shining, I think it sort of was like, well, now anybody can make these pictures. It became a very viable genre on all budget levels, which was not true before.
Dressed to kill, murder made to order.
Dressed to Kill was pretty obviously, even though I think De Palma denies this, I think De Palma says he had never seen an Argento movie, and that may in fact well be the case. Sometimes these things just sort of seep into the consciousness. But it did seem like he was bringing certain aesthetic concepts of the giallo into American horror films. You know how he used the star filters for so like reflections would show up and they go ping, and just like this sort of gliding cinematography, and everything felt sort of dreamlike.
It has a sexual feel to it, even more than most horror films.
I was really interested in the contrast between the depiction of violence and an incongruously beautiful presentation.
fade to black.
Fade to Black, starring Dennis Christopher. It's a reaction to the burgeoning slasher genre. So it's about a horror nerd who dresses as different classic monsters to kind of enact these sort of revenge murders. People that have wronged him throughout his life. Its finale takes place on top of Grauman's Chinese Theater on Hollywood Boulevard. It's a very weird time capsule portrait of people living on the fringes of Los Angeles in 1980. And it's a nice illustration of the horror fan as outcast, which is a pretty big shadow hanging over the 80s, I think.
In one corner, people are going to say Motel Hell is complete garbage, violent, gruesome, sickening, and perverse. In the other corner, people are going to defend Motel Hell, saying it's a comedy that achieves a kind of demented, satirical genius in the way it criticizes such other sleazoid trash as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Genius in how they got the title because it was Motel Hello and the neon was burnt out. Blew my mind, thought it was so awesome. Then you get into a movie that you're like, wow, this is creepy and scary. You know, to be buried up to the neck, and like that got me.
Two great villains, one who wore a pig head and wielded a chainsaw. That was really great.
This was one of the last pictures of cowboy actor Rory Calhoun, who was very skinny and I think probably had cancer at the time.
Ida will show you the way.
You want us to register?
No, that won't be necessary.
Dig it.
That chainsaw fight at the end. The chainsaw is the worst weapon you could ever use for any kind of fight. All you have to do is throw anything into the web of a chainsaw and it stops. So it's about the worst weapon you could ever use.
If you want to go to something that really catches the spirit of the 80s, don't look any further. Also, what a great title.
Maniac. Ooh, I love Maniac. The thing that makes Maniac a true stand-apart film is the quality of the performances. Top-notch casting, top-notch storytelling, amazing editing. That movie moves like fucking lightning. When he slows the movie down, he does it for a reason, to set you up for the next thing.
It's a little strong for my tastes. It's a testament to its power. You have Tom Savini doing the makeup effects, who had come from Vietnam and knew all about what Bodies Rent Asunder looked like. You've got scalpings in that movie that are incredibly effective because they're so real. That's a very independent movie that could not get on movie screens today, but there was a small but hungry audience for that. And that's the precursor to torture porn that, Hostel came along much later and started a whole new subgenre.
The VHS era, is hard to convey to someone who grew up in the post-Napster digital era when everything is available by some means. You suddenly had access to a world of cinema beyond just your hazy memories of the Hammer films they played when you were a kid on, Channel 11.
It was the age of the video store, and there was one on every street corner. You could browse forever and watch things that no normal person would ever normally watch. And this was a goldmine for young indie directors who had no budget but had a good imagination.
Nobody has the movie I want.
Hey, if it's on video, Blockbuster probably has it. I mean, we have over 10,000 videos.
Wow.
Everybody went to the video store. That was the way you started your evening.
Running down to the local rental store to see, what can I get away with renting without my mom here?
And we had the Beta versus VHS battles. It was like the Coke-Pepsi battle of the videotech world at the time. And obviously VHS won out. And that's what the stores had.
There was a certain magic to the VHS tape. I remember the first one we rented was Nightmare on Elm Street and Critters and something for my mom.
And then you had the personal curation aspect. I could collect videos. Now I could have the equivalent of albums, but in film form. Suddenly I felt a kind of ownership of the content in a way that I never had felt before.
Nobody cares about owning movies anymore now. No one covets holding it. It's all just like in the cloud.
Everything's through your digital device, your phone, your iPad. And there's definitely a certain coldness to the process.
We were the first generation to really discover all this stuff through cable, which meant we got it earlier, which meant it was even more taboo than like the earlier generations that had to kind of sneak into theaters and whatnot. Now, all of a sudden, it's being beamed into my house. I'm by myself for 3 hours because my mom works. Ooh, what's on Cinemax? What's on HBO? I had the benefits of cable, and I had the benefits of the rental system.
You had to make some decisions about what you wanted to watch that night.
It would have everything from a Universal picture that, you know, Tobe Hooper got tapped to make, to stuff that was shot on video, like The Ripper. Tom Savini starring in The Ripper. We rented that, and I thought I was going to get a real movie, and it was like shot on video. I couldn't believe I was watching, like, I just paid the same $3 that I would have paid for a studio release, and it was Tom Savini running around in a shot on video thing.
You suddenly had this great outpouring of poorly written, poorly directed, poorly acted films, but then you would have the occasional gem.
Guys like Charlie Band, guys like Roger Corman found a whole new life on home video after the VHS explosion happened.
Charlie Band really invented direct-to-video.
Charlie was churning them out.
Empire Pictures and Charlie Band at the time provided opportunity to up-and-coming talent to make their mark. They're chasing trends that the bigger guys are doing and trying to get there more quickly and more cheaply. Charles Band provided this sort of unending flow of product, and some of it had real worth.
They're cheesy. A lot of blood and gore, bad effects and bad acting and ridiculous storylines. They were right up my alley, and I loved them.
A lot of fans have said to me that they saw Hellraiser for the first time because they were browsing through the shelves of Blockbuster and they paused when they got to the image of Pinhead. He's making very direct eye contact with you. What the image says is, look what I did to myself. Now imagine what I could do to you.
Video cover art didn't seem that important initially until some of those key horror films started appearing, and on the basis of their success, then suddenly those covers became quite important. So the brighter and the more shocking it could possibly be, then the better and the more chance of that video being picked up.
They had to have that art there to get you to grab an unknown title as opposed to something you might be familiar with from its theatrical release.
Back then, you really had to go looking for stuff. You had to be willing to take chances. And if it had a really cool poster on the front or cover art, I was hooked.
It's the staff picks that usually would pick something that would be like, you want to rent this, don't rent that. That you'll always be able to rent that. You won't rent that. Those people knew. They knew what the good films were because they had access to them.
One of my sort of Bibles of 80s horror was the poster for Terror in the Aisles, because the skull in the front of Terror in the Aisles was made up of all the titles of the names of the movies in it. So I would go pick up Terror in the Aisles in the video store, and I'd start to go through, and I'd walk through, and I'd try to find different movies. But it really opened me up to a lot of movies I would have never rented otherwise.
I worked for the company that did the Halloween posters, that fabulous, iconic knife going through the pumpkin of the jack-o'-lantern. That kind of said it all without saying anything, I thought that was a brilliant, brilliant ad campaign.
The Nightmare on Elm Street poster features Nancy's face, and she's laying in bed. It's a great poster. I mean, it's art. It's not like a photo like a lot of movie posters are nowadays. You just have like a photo of the stars and they're like in a cute position. And that photo art is now kind of dominant. But back then, they really commissioned someone to create a painting. Matthew Peak was able to do all of the posters for Nightmare on Elm Street, which is rare. There's a continuity and they're really beautiful and unique. That reflects to me, the high level of artistry that went to all parts of Nightmare on Elm Street, even though it was a really low-budget movie.
I have a memory of driving on Sunset Boulevard, and there was a high-rise building, and the whole side of it was the painted poster of Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, like on a giant building. And I remember being very impressed with that. Kit Carson, it was his idea to make a Breakfast Club parody. I thought that was brilliant. I think that also, let people know that we were, not as serious as they maybe wanted Chainsaw 2 to be.
The original poster art that Toby wanted to go with was not going to be the Breakfast Club. He ended up going with the Breakfast Club to sort of trick a lot of exhibitors into putting it up in their displays because it looks very innocuous. It doesn't look like a horror movie, really. It looks like a Halloween movie. It looks like a costume movie.
You have to remember that advertising very seldom actually represents the movie correctly.
Had I seen the artwork for Chopping Mall, I also would not have rented it. It has nothing to do with the movie.
The gimmick with The Howling was that we wanted to position it as a normal slasher-ish kind of movie and not give away the fact that it had supernatural elements and werewolves. Eventually they came up with what I think was a very clever poster of a clawed hand ripping the poster, and then behind it is a woman screaming. And in Europe, for whatever reason, they decided they didn't want to use the woman, they wanted to use a snout for a werewolf. So in the British ads, it's the same ad, but instead of a woman's face, it's a snout. You wanted to try to differentiate your product from movies that were aimed at a somewhat lower market. And the idea was to try to vault over the expectations and be able to appeal to a wider audience. You try to get them in through whatever means you can. However, you have to misrepresent the movie. And then by the time they've seen it, it's too late. They can't get their money back.